10. The Voice of Reason. Throughout Europe, the late medieval era saw the repudiation of the Galatian doctrine of the freedom of the Church as a separate power under Christ the King. All of Europe was concerned with controlling the Church within their political realms as a branch of civil government. Henry VIII's resolution was more open, but by no means more radical than that of Catholic monarchs. Symbolically, Henry VIII demonstrated his position by destroying, in 1538, the shrine of St. Thomas Becket and forbidding the celebration of his feast on the grounds that there appeareth nothing in his life, an exterior or conversation, whereby he should be called a saint, but rather a rebel and traitor to his prince. Becket was important to the court of Henry VIII. As Lockyer noted, it was Becket who embodied the full Hildebrandian theory that the Church was a monarchy ruled over by the Pope, and the princes of Europe were the Pope's feudal vassals. Lockyer's summation of Hildebrand's doctrine is not altogether accurate, but he is thoroughly right in seeing the modern era as in revolt against Hildebrand's reforms. The state saw itself as sovereign and as the voice of reason and law. The new doctrines of state were increasingly the common property of groups on all levels of society. Thus, the Diggers, in The True Leveller's Standard Advanced, 1649, spoke of the great creator, reason. Steadily, God became reason, and the incarnation in ongoing history of reason was seen as the state, the sovereign. Thomas Hobbes developed the doctrine of state sovereignty rigorously. For Hobbes, even the powers of legally constituted representatives of the Crown were strictly circumscribed by royal permission. In fact, all subordinate powers existed by the permission of the Crown. Of systems subordinate, some are political and some private. Political, otherwise called bodies of politique, and persons in law, are those which are made by authority from the sovereign power of the Commonwealth. Private are those which are constituted by subjects among themselves, or by authority from a stranger. For no authority derived from foreign power within the dominion of another is public there, but private. And of private systems, some are lawful, some unlawful. Lawful are those which are allowed by Commonwealth, all others are unlawful. Irregular systems are those which, having no representative, consist only in concourse of people, which, if not forbidden by the Commonwealth, nor made on evil designs, such as are conflux of people to markets, or shows, or any other harmless end, are lawful. But when the intention is evil, or, if the number be considerable, unknown, they are unlawful. Clearly, Hobbes is the father, or at least the transmitter of much that marks the modern era and state. First, all institutions, associations, and even agencies or branches of the civil government exist only by the permission of the sovereign power. In other words, they exist by grace alone. Status grace. Second, there can be thus no universal church having any independence from civil government. The church must be under the control of the state. As Hobbes stated it, I define a church to be a company of men professing Christian religion, united in the person of one sovereign, at whose command they ought to assemble, and without whose authority they ought not to assemble. And because in all commonwealths that assemble, which is without warrant from the civil sovereign, is unlawful, that church also which is assembled in any commonwealth that hath forbidden them to assemble is an unlawful assembly. It followed also that there is on earth no such universal church as all Christians are bound to obey, because there is no power on earth to which all other commonwealths are subject. There are no Christians in the dominions of several princes and states, but every one of them is subject to that commonwealth, whereof he is himself a member, and consequently cannot be subject to the commands of any other person. And therefore a church, such a one as is capable to command, to judge, absolve, condemn, or do any other act, is that same thing with a civil commonwealth, consisting of Christian men, and is called a civil state, for that the subjects thereof are Christians. Temporal and spiritual government are but two words brought into the world to make men see double and mistake their lawful sovereign. It is true that the bodies of the faithful after the resurrection shall be not only spiritual but eternal, but in this life they are gross and corruptible. There is therefore no other government in this life, neither state nor religion, but temporal, nor teaching of any doctrine lawful to any subject, which is the governor both of the state and of the religion, forbiddeth to be taught. And the governor must be one, or else there must needs follow faction, and civil war in the commonwealth between the church and state, between spiritualists and temporalists, between the sword of justice and the shield of faith, and, which is more, in every Christian man's own breast, between the Christian and the man. The doctors of the church are called pastors, so also are civil sovereigns. But if pastors be not subordinate one to another, so that there be one chief pastor, men will be taught contrary doctrines, whereof both may be and one must be false. Who that one chief pastor is, according to the law of nature, hath been already shown, namely, that is the civil sovereign. This is totalitarianism, the logical outcome of humanism in every form. Because the church for Hobbes exists only by the grace of the civil sovereign, there can be no freedom of religion except by the permission of the state. This means that religion can only have establishment and or toleration, not freedom. Third, we have seen in Hobbes what is now a truism of humanism, namely that religion is a private affair, whereas concerns of state are public concerns. If the state is sovereign, then the state's business is a public concern. If the triune God is alone Lord or sovereign, then all concerns are religious and public, and the Church and Christianity the supremely public concerns. Hobbes saw the Church, apart from the state's permission, as an unlawful private association. How deeply the thinking of Henry VIII and Hobbes had become a part of American thinking became apparent in the late 1970s and the 1980s as evangelical Christians became politically active. The Liberals showed righteous shock and horror, and some press and other media pundits snarled in anger that Christianity, which should be a private concern, was insisting on becoming public. The humanistic conservatives were often no less distressed, and they alternated between hostility and attempts to use Christian activism. In Jean-Jacques Rousseau's day, the public nature of the state and the private nature of Christianity had become ideas seen as natural truths. In the Social Contract, Chapter 7, of the sovereign, Rousseau logically held that the sovereign cannot be under law because he is the source of law. Consequently, it is against the nature of the body politic that the sovereign should impose upon himself a law which he cannot infringe. Like Hobbes, Rousseau was emphatic that the body politic or sovereign can never bind itself. Given this fact, consequently, the sovereign power need give no guarantee to its subjects, since it is impossible that the body should wish to injure all its members, nor as we shall see later, can it injure any single individual? Somehow, this is no comfort to anyone who loses a son in a needless war or property to the state because of confiscatory taxes. Rousseau was only able to declare that such a state cannot injure any of its members, nor deprive any of their freedoms by redefining injury and freedom. Since the state is sovereign for Rousseau, the state is thus the source of both law and definition as the god of the social order. When George Orwell, in 1984, wrote about newspeak and doublethink, he was recognizing the logical implications of sovereignty. Language and meaning become what the state says they are. John chapter 1 verse 1 declares, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." The logic of Rousseau leads to the conclusion, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with the body politic, and the Word was the body politic. For Rousseau, both law and definition proceed from the general will as expressed in the state. As a result, he could say concerning freedom, in order then that the social compact may not be but a vain formula, it must contain, though unexpressed, the single understanding which can alone give force to the whole, namely, that whoever shall refuse to obey the general will must be constrained by the whole body of his fellow citizens to do so, which is no more than to say, it may be necessary to compel a man to be free, freedom being that condition which, by giving each citizen to his country, guarantees him from all personal dependence, and is the foundation upon which the whole political machine rests, and supplies the power which works in it. Only the recognition by the individual of the rights of the community can give legal force to undertakings entered into between citizens, which, otherwise, would become absurd, tyrannical, and exposed to vast abuses. Compelling men to be free was the logic of the Soviet Gulag. For Rousseau, freedom for the Church creates in a society two powers and two sovereigns. Of all the Christian authors, the philosopher Hobbes alone has seen the evil clearly, and the remedy too. Only he has dared to propose that the two heads of the eagle should be united, and that all should be brought into a single political whole, without which no state and no government can ever be firmly established. But he should have seen that the arrogant spirit of Christianity is incompatible with his system. Given this heritage, the modern state assumes the right to govern the Church as a part of its natural jurisdiction. In the case of the Supreme Court of the United States, October term 1985, Ohio Civil Rights Commission, Appellant versus Dayton, Ohio, Christian Schools, Appellees, Attorney William Bentley Ball, was retained by the Dayton Christian Schools. At stake was the freedom of the Christian schools to govern itself in terms of biblical faith. In an amicus curiae filed by the Rutherford Institute, attorneys F. Tatum, John W. Whitehead, and 11 others, attention was called to the essentially iconoclastic role of intermediate associations in democratic theory and practice. A fair description of that role must concede that associations have not always served the instrumental aim of advancing public values, either in their social practices or in their ideological agendas. Indeed, the dominant impact of associations has probably been to perpetuate traditional views and practices as against developing constitutional norms. They have, in any case, at least frequently advanced rules that diverge from constitutional norms. The role of associations in permitting divergence between private and public values is thus an important feature of our form of government, as it has functioned historically. For this court to adopt a constitutional rule requiring private associations to conform to public values would therefore effect a shift away from our historical form of government. The power of an association to govern itself is indeed an awesome power, for it is the power to constitute a sphere of authority independent of the state. It was precisely this recognition that led Hobbes and Rousseau to opine against associations. Increasingly, by asserting the sovereignty of the state, courts and civil bureaucracies are denying the freedom of Christianity to exist uncontrolled by the state. Associational freedom is denied in the name of the state's superior reason. The foundations of the 20th century totalitarian trends were established by the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. R.W. Harris wrote that the period of 1660 to 1789 was a great period of state-making. It developed the concept of the Enlightenment despot. Mercier La Rivière, 1767, held, in Harris's summary, that the Enlightenment despot is one whose laws are the true expression of the needs of society. He is the one from whom abundance arises, the one whose very glance makes the most barren land fruitful. According to Montesquieu, law in general is human reason. These doctrines prepared the way for the Age of Revelation, 1789 onwards. Men who saw themselves as an intellectual elite felt that they, the voice of reason and virtue, were destined to rule all other men. Robespierre saw himself, as Otto Scott has written, as the voice of virtue. Thus, anyone critical of Robespierre was, by definition, the voice of evil and unreason. Virtually all our tyrants since then have likewise identified themselves as law, virtue, and reason incarnate, and Christianity as the enemy of these things. Such a belief means that these men are playing God, and the Lord God of hosts does not take kindly to rebels and apers. It has often been observed that men who do not learn from history are condemned to repeat it. In 1607, John Cowell, in The Interpreter, held that the king, being sovereign, was above both parliament and law. He was above the law by his absolute power, and hence above parliament's control. This was the belief of Charles I, and it led to civil war. The failure of men today to recognize the implications of sovereignty is leading again to futile conflict and ensuring that conflict is grim. The logic of our time resembles the Egypt of the ancient pharaohs. The pharaohs were regarded as living gods on earth. So far as we know, Egypt had no detailed legal code or a written body of laws, only legal documents. According to Sorna, the plausible explanation is that the concept of the king's divinity was not compatible with the existence of the independent authority of a written codified law. A steady growth of regulations and agencies of control replacing fundamental law give evidence that the modern state does not tolerate any law binding upon itself. For the humanistic state, it is the people who must be bound, and the state freed.